What if the one place a child should feel safest becomes a place of unimaginable horror? What if the very person meant to protect them is the one inflicting the worst kind of pain? Before we get into this tragic and deeply disturbing case, I want to welcome all our viewers. If you're new here, you are highly welcome to True Crime Zip. If you love true crime stories packed with suspense, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This case is one of the most harrowing we've ever covered, but it's also a story of justice. Let's begin. June 2019. A small town in Iowa, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and crime is more of an afterthought than a reality. But beneath the quiet streets of Bloomfield, a horror beyond comprehension was finally brought to light. Stephen Douglas Crook Jr., a seemingly ordinary man, was sentenced to 120 years in prison. His crime? The prolonged, horrific abuse of his own daughter. This wasn't just a case of abuse, it was an act of unthinkable evil. From the time she was an infant, Crook subjected his daughter to years of unspeakable suffering. But he didn't just commit these crimes in the shadows. He broadcasted them to an audience, live-streaming his horrific acts for the darkest corners of the internet to see. His crimes only came to light in March 2018, when law enforcement finally intervened and rescued the little girl, who was just 6 years old. But this case wasn't just about Crook. The girl's own mother, Kendra Hoover, wasn't an innocent bystander. Authorities say she knew. She saw evidence of the abuse, and she chose to ignore it. Today, we break down this case piece by piece, unraveling how one of the most disturbing crimes in recent history was uncovered. Bloomfield, Iowa, is the kind of town where violent crime is a rarity. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked at night and wave at each other from their porches. But as we've seen time and time again, darkness can exist even in the most unsuspecting places. Stephen Crook Jr. had no prior criminal record that would have raised suspicions. To the outside world, he was just another man living an unremarkable life. He had friends, he had a job, and most people who knew him wouldn't have imagined what was happening behind closed doors. But behind those doors, a nightmare was unfolding. Imagine a child, not even old enough to speak, being forced to endure things no one should ever have to experience. From infancy, this little girl suffered in silence. She had no words to describe what was happening to her, no way to tell anyone the pain she was in. Stephen Crook didn't just abuse her, he documented it. He took photos and videos of the assaults, collecting them like trophies. Even more disturbing, he shared these horrific acts with others, live-streaming them on a popular social media app called Live.me. He wasn't just committing these atrocities in private, he was encouraging an audience to watch. An audience that existed in the darkest corners of the internet, where people like him found encouragement instead of condemnation. You might be asking yourself, where was the child's mother? How could this go on for years without her knowing? That's the question prosecutors asked, too. And the answer is just as horrifying. Kendra Hoover wasn't blind to the abuse. She saw it. She found videos. She saw evidence. And she chose to look the other way. Instead of stepping in, instead of saving her daughter, she let it continue. It remains unclear how exactly Crook was caught. Authorities haven't released details on whether it was a tip, an investigation, or something else that led them to his door. But in March 2018, law enforcement finally stepped in. They entered his home. They rescued the girl. And they uncovered the sickening collection of evidence Crook had amassed over the years. One folder in his digital library stood out. It was labeled, Child Porn and Baby Rape. Even seasoned investigators were left shaken by what they found. March 2018. The quiet neighborhood of Bloomfield, Iowa, had no idea that behind closed doors, a horrifying crime was unfolding. For 6 years, Stephen Douglas Crook Jr. had managed to keep his atrocities hidden. But every criminal makes mistakes, and it was only a matter of time before his secrets unraveled. The investigation into Crook's activities began after an anonymous tip reached law enforcement. The details were vague but disturbing. Claims of a child being subjected to unspeakable acts, evidence that something horrific was being broadcast online. Authorities knew they had to act fast. Every moment wasted meant further suffering for an innocent child. The question remains, who tipped them off? Was it a concerned viewer? A slip-up from Crook himself? Or did someone close to him finally come forward? Whatever the case, investigators wasted no time. They needed concrete evidence before making a move, ensuring that when they struck, there would be no room for escape. Armed with a search warrant, federal agents and local law enforcement descended upon Crook's residence in the early hours of a cold March morning. They had one goal: to remove the child from harm and gather as much evidence as possible. As officers breached the house, they were met with a chilling scene. The home was in disarray, but their focus was on one room, the place where Crook carried out his despicable acts. When they found the little girl, her face was devoid of emotion, a heartbreaking sign of what she had endured. She had known nothing but suffering since infancy. But that morning, her nightmare was about to end. Authorities immediately took Crook into custody. His arrest was swift, and he offered little resistance. Perhaps he knew his time was up. But even with him behind bars, investigators had a long road ahead. What they uncovered in that house would haunt them forever. As forensic teams combed through Crook's computers, hard drives, and online accounts, they uncovered a level of depravity that shook even the most seasoned investigators. Hundreds of images and videos documented years of abuse. But what was even more chilling was the realization that some of these crimes had been broadcast live to an unknown audience. One particular folder stood out, a grotesquely labeled file containing footage no human should ever witness. It was undeniable proof of Crook's guilt. Investigators now had the task of tracing where these broadcasts had been sent. Who had been watching? Were there others involved? Meanwhile, another disturbing question arose. Where was the girl's mother during all of this? Kendra Hoover, the mother of the victim, was not an absent figure in this child's life. She lived in the same home. She had access to Crook's devices. Could she have truly been unaware of what was happening? Investigators soon found evidence that shattered any possibility of ignorance. Hoover had, at some point, viewed at least some of the footage. But instead of taking action, she did nothing. No police report. No attempt to stop Crook. Just silence. As the authorities pieced together the timeline, it became evident that Hoover had enabled the abuse through inaction. But why? Was it fear? Was she complicit? As the case against Crook solidified, the walls were closing in on Hoover as well. In June 2019, Stephen Crook faced the justice system. The evidence against him was overwhelming. There was no plea for innocence, no attempt to claim misunderstanding. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of sexual exploitation of a child, fully aware that he would never walk free again. During sentencing, Judge Stephanie Rose did not hold back. She described Crook's crimes as beyond comprehension, a level of evil that required complete removal from society. The courtroom was silent as she handed down a sentence that ensured he would never harm another child again, 120 years in federal prison. But there was still one unresolved piece to this nightmare: Kendra Hoover. With Crook imprisoned, attention turned to Hoover. Could she be held accountable for allowing the abuse to continue? The prosecution argued that she had failed in her most fundamental duty, to protect her child. The courtroom watched as prosecutors laid out the case. Hoover had been aware of at least some of the abuse and chose not to act. Whether out of fear, indifference, or some twisted loyalty to Crook, she had failed her daughter in the most devastating way possible. Her trial date was set. The public, already reeling from Crook's crimes, demanded justice. Would she be punished for her inaction? News of the case spread across Iowa and beyond. Parents questioned how such evil could go unnoticed. Neighbors wondered if there had ever been signs they had missed. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Advocacy groups rallied, pushing for stronger protections for children in vulnerable situations. Conversations about online exploitation surged. The case became more than just one family's horror. It became a wake-up call. September arrived, and Hoover's trial commenced. Prosecutors presented their evidence, highlighting her failure to report the abuse despite knowing it had happened. The defense attempted to paint her as another victim, but the jury was unconvinced. After deliberation, the verdict was read, guilty. Hoover was convicted on multiple counts of child endangerment and neglect. Her sentencing ensured she, too, would face years behind bars, though nothing compared to Crook's fate. Justice, though delayed, had arrived. With both Crook and Hoover imprisoned, the young girl was placed in protective care. Her future remained uncertain, but she was finally safe. The scars of her past would never fully fade, but she was no longer trapped in that house of horrors. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies doubled down on tracking online predators. The case had revealed how easily such crimes could be hidden in plain sight. Authorities urged the public to be vigilant, because, sometimes, the worst crimes happen behind the most ordinary doors. This case forces us to ask difficult questions. How many more children are suffering in silence? How can we ensure that justice reaches every victim? And most importantly, if you suspect something, would you speak up? Let's talk about it in the comments. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know below. And if you found this story compelling, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. There are more cases to uncover, and together we can shine a light on the darkest corners of the world. Thank you for watching True Crime Zip. Stay aware, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.